Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here today. On behalf of Sexto Piso publishers, we want to thank Jane Smiley for being here with us, and also Laura Hermoso for having accepted her this invitation. For us, for Sexto Piso, the work of Jane Smiley, of whom we have published already 4 books, is one of our main basis pillars of our catalog. She is one of these authors of whom we could say, without falling onto a cliche, that she doesn't need any introduction. 1,000 Acres has been recently republished in Spanish, and this has earned her the Pulitzer Prize and the National Critics Award of the United States. And without further ado, I will leave the stage to them.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us or watching this on streamings. Thank you also to Espacio Fundación Telefónica for hosting again this event, and thanks to Sexto Piso for their invitation, for having published and recovered Jane Smiley's work in Spain. Santiago has just mentioned the titles that they have published, and I strongly advise you to buy them and read them. We're going to talk today about 1,000 Acres. This is the novel that earned Jane the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, 3 decades ago. This was a novel that really put her on the scene, and that put her name among the main referrals of the current novel in the United States. Before this, she wanted to do horseback riding. She wanted to become a top model. She is very tall. She could have definitely made it in this field. And she spent some time in Ireland with a Fulbright grant. In Iceland. Yeah. Sorry. And I think that her writing really displays all her experiences, all that she has lived, and everything that she heard in her own house, the oral tradition in her family. I always say that when you read Jane Smiley, or when I read Jane Smiley, this helped me understand my family better, to understand my parents and how they were before I was born. I think she is the great writer in the family, and I think that this is not a minor thing, because think about the Russians. So I don't want to bore you with my comments, but welcome here, Jane Smiley. I don't know if this is strange to you to be here to talk about a novel that you published 3 decades ago. Have you read it again later?
No.
Nope.
Sometime maybe 15 years ago or so. After the movie was made, I read through the novel again.
No quiero ser pesada.
I don't want to insist too much on this, but I want to give the people some background. I'm sure that many of the audience, the people in the audience here, have read the novel, and there is a film that was shot in the 90s. But I think we need to explain a few things. 1,000 Acres, I think that, as I said, Jane Smiley is the great writer of families, and this is a family story. This takes place in Iowa, in a fictitious state, and the story turns around a farm, maybe 2. Larry Cook, who is a farmer that has turned his farm into the most important farm of the county, the 1,000 Acres in the original title. He is a widower. He has 3 daughters, and he makes this decision of leaving the farm to his 3 daughters. However, this really opens Pandora's box, because because this sometimes somewhat non-important decision might change our lives. And this is the free interpretation of Jane Smiley of King Lear's, Shakespeare's King Lear's. And I wonder, I know that Jane decided to rewrite his own version of King Lear, and she realized that the king spoke a lot, but the daughters didn't have a voice. So I wonder, at what time do you decide that this king will be based in Iowa?
Iowa at the time. I lived in a town called Ames, where I taught at Iowa State University. And Ames is just south of Minneapolis, about 4 hours or something. And we were in Minneapolis having fun, and we came home, and it was late winter, and it was twilight, and we passed through the northern Iowa, and I looked around, and it was as flat as a pancake. And I thought it was very spooky. And I said to my husband, this is where I'm going to set that Lear novel. And then the area turned out to be much more interesting than I knew at the time, because you always have to do a lot of research into your setting when you're writing a novel about a particular place. Anyway, that area had been a swamp, and then immigrants from eastern England had drained the swamp by digging deep drainage wells into the water, and that meant that the water drained. But then when insecticides and other poisons became common in American agriculture, that meant that the local farmers were taking in a lot of poisons. And that, to me, made the spot and the novel even more interesting.
Claro, la novela es una historia familiar.
The novel is a family story, but it talks about ecological farming compared to traditional farming, and it talks about family secrets. But let's go back to the beginning in order to talk chronologically about the novel. So we have Jeannie, Rose, and Caroline, and Jeannie is the narrator of the novel. On who did you base this character? Who did you copy these voices from? Who did you take them from?
Based on Goneril. Rose is based on Reagan. Caroline is based on Cordelia. Larry is based on Lear. So every character has the first initial of his or her word that's the same as a character in King Lear. Because I wanted, let's say this way, I wanted not only to constantly remind myself who's talking in terms of the play, but I wanted the reader to know that King Lear is in the background. And so that's how the characters were sorted out.
Quizá donde más se aleja.
Maybe where you step aside and you take a step back from the story is when Larry, the patriarch of this family, this Iowa farmer, is an incestuous dad. And why did you want to add this piece of information, this cruelty, to the character?
I don't remember.
Han pasado muchos años.
Too many years have gone by, I suppose.
Say that when I looked into the material that was behind King Lear, I noticed that it was very Nordic. And I had spent a lot of years studying the Icelandic sagas. And I had also written a previous book called The Greenlanders, which is about the Greenland colony during the late Middle Ages and how it goes bust. And so I knew that if Larry and Never mind. I knew that if Lear was based on Nordic material, there would be vengefulness, there would be the readiness to attack, and there would be a kind of feudal, literally feuding society.
Y ahora cuando piensa en Larry Koch, ¿lo ve como un hombre malo?
So when you think about Larry now, do you think of an evil man, or do you see him as a victim of the circumstances, or does he have what we now call a fragile masculinity?
Him as someone who always wanted to be the boss, who was willing to do anything to be the boss, and then begins going through the early stages of dementia. And so there are ways in which I sympathize or feel sorry for him, but there are also ways in which I think he gets what he deserves. And I think that's also true of Lear.
Sí, de hecho
Yes, in fact, the male characters in the novel, I'm also thinking about the youngest ones, aren't they somewhat victims of the heritage of their family and the education that they received?
I would say so. I mean, all of them live in an extremely fertile and valuable region. And so all of them it's sort of like actually living in the Middle Ages. They do not have a will of their own. They don't have very many opportunities to get out of town. I mean, Caroline does get out of town, and she does not want to come back. But the others think they're going to make it somehow on the farm. And farming, even in a really fertile area, is a difficult life. And so some of them have different forms of expertise, but they all sort of go back and forth between, desperation, greed, worry, it's going to be okay. So they live a kind of nervous existence because of where they live and what they do.
Jane, usted creció en...
You were brought up in a loving household. Your childhood was comfortable and happy. What you know about family cruelty, you learned it in the books. Is this the main purpose of literature, to get us ready for the hits that life is going to throw at us?
I don't think so. I think the main purpose of literature, of the novel at any rate, is to explore. So if you did have a difficult childhood, and this happens to many writers, they grow up, they learn to write, and they use their material to explore their own difficulties in their own childhood. What a novel does is it forces you to make a logical system out of whatever it is that's going on in the novel. And once you make that logical system, you can sort of set it aside. I wrote a novel called Good Faith later than this that was based on some experiences that my husband had in the 80s in the collapsing and very corrupt real estate business. And when I met him, it was 15 years since it was all over. And but he still was obsessed with it. And so in order for him to sort of think about it and make sense of it, I wrote a novel about a guy in the 80s who's cheated by a person that he thinks is his best friend. And once that novel was finished, and I'd read it to him, and he informed me and all that stuff, then he was able to set that experience aside. But for other writers like me, who did not grow up in, horrifying circumstances or have strange things happen, novel writing is more about curiosity. You see something, you hear about something, it gets your interest, and you decide, oh, that would make a good novel. And obviously, I had no personal experience of medieval Greenland, but I thought the end of the Greenland colony was totally fascinating, and that's why I wrote that book. I thought my husband's experiences were fascinating. That's why I wrote that book. So I'm an avid eavesdropper. I'm going to admit that. And so sometimes I'll hear something and I'll think, oh, yeah.
Un poquito cotilla, ¿no? Hay que hacer para hacer novela.
You need to be a bit gossipy, don't you? To be a writer and write novels.
Absolutely. I mean, that was my family all over, gossipy to the core when I was growing up. And one of the things that I realized when I started reading lots and lots of novels was that novels just thrive on gossip because the characters have to talk to one another. They have to give their opinions to one another about what's happening. And so that's the energy in the novel, is the way that the characters think and talk about what's going on. And so gossip is really at the core.
Los personajes,
the characters talk a lot, but in this novel, A Thousand Acres, they also keep secrets. In fact, they keep a big secret. I read in the novel, people keep secrets when the rest of the people do not want to hear the truth. Family silences are also a legacy that we receive. Are these a toxic legacy?
Well, as a gossipy person, I would say so. But that's for every person to decide for themselves. I mean, the other thing you have to do when you're writing a novel is hold back information, because you want the reader to keep reading in order to find things out. So the source of Ginny and Rose's antipathy toward their father, or feelings about their father, I kept that to myself, and they kept that to themselves, which is a natural thing given what the source is. But the classic sort of plot type novel is a murder mystery, and the best mystery writers give the reader one bit of information at a time until finally there's the big reveal. But every novelist has to do the same thing. You just have to figure out a way to hand it out a bit at a time.
Y volviendo a lo que es a la novela.
Going back to this novel, to A Thousand Acres, I talked about the legacy, the family secrets as legacy. Jeannie says that part of her legacy is loneliness. I would never have thought that solitude is something that you could inherit as well.
Well, the solitude for her comes not only from her secrets, but also from the fact that she doesn't really have anybody in the neighborhood to talk to. They live, a large farm is an isolated place. They don't go into town much. It's not like living in a suburb or a city where you just naturally connect with people. And I would also say that she's an introvert. And so the more she doesn't connect, then the more she's going to not connect in the future. And then with all the issues around her father and her sisters, she doesn't know how she can connect. And then there's the issues around her miscarriages. There's something, I think, in those days, at any rate, about having miscarriages that's embarrassing for a woman who wants to be a mother and sees mothers all around her. So she's not only sad about that, she's a little bit embarrassed about it.
Pero fíjese, ¿no?
But miscarriages, natural miscarriages. We speak a lot about this being a taboo topic, but in a novel that you published at the beginning of the 90s, you already talked about this, and this is something that really caught my attention from your novel, that you are reinterpreting a classical novel by Shakespeare, but you are actually introducing very disruptive elements. Was this also a way of breaking these taboos, or there was no taboo back then?
Probably didn't know if there was a taboo. You know, I'm the kind of writer who just does what I want to do and hopes for the best. And, you know, I went to college in the late 60s, early 70s. Then I went to graduate school all through the 70s. And we talked about everything, so it didn't strike me that there was something you shouldn't talk about. And I should say that in my family, we talked about all kinds of things too. So I didn't come from, say, a religious family where you weren't supposed to talk about this or that.
Usted es una escritora cotilla que...
So you're a gossipy writer who does whatever you want, and I wonder... The American society, when this novel was published at the beginning of the 90s, were they shocked by when you talked about incest or miscarriages?
Yeah. I'd already gone on to the next novel. I was happy for it to be published. I didn't get any hate mail. The thing I was most worried about, I guess, was that somebody would say, "How dare you rewrite William Shakespeare? Are you kidding me?" But I didn't have that problem either. So, I also lived in Iowa. I lived in the middle of nowhere. I just did whatever. And I didn't worry about stuff.
¿Le sorprendió ganar?
Were you surprised when you were awarded the Pulitzer Prize? I know that you were pregnant when you received this award and that you didn't have a very big experience.
No, I wasn't pregnant. I wasn't pregnant yet. That was the following year.
Oh.
It wasn't that year. No, I had a daughter who was 13 and another daughter who was 11. And yeah, I was surprised, but I really didn't know how to process it, you know. It wasn't something I had thought about before. And when I discovered that maybe I'd won the Pulitzer Prize, my daughter was home sick from school, and I looked at her and I said, "Honey, I think I won the Pulitzer Prize." She said, "Huh." And I thought, oh, unimpressed.
Hay muchas cosas que me interesan.
There are many things that interest me from A Thousand Acres. One of them is the way that Ginny and Rose face the trauma. One of them from a revengeful thinking, and the other one from denial. Each of them faces trauma in as they know, as they want, or as they can, you would say.
Yes, I mean, I did run into a psychologist a few years ago at a book store who had read A Thousand Acres. And he said that the way I portrayed Ginny and Rose was the way that women who faced that particular trauma reacted. Some reacted in one way and some reacted in the other way. And he said it was extremely realistic, and I went, phew.
Bloquear recuerdos desagradables como hace Ginny es...
Blocking nasty memories is a way of surviving. We all tell ourselves lies in order to fall asleep every night, would you say?
I think that really depends on the person. I don't know, because I don't have any terribly nasty memories to block. And so what keeps me awake is, you know, worrying about the children, worrying about things that are about to happen or could happen, not things that have happened. So.
Otra cosa que me interesa es cómo se...
Other thing that interests me is the relationship of Ginny and Rose with forgiveness. Do they need to forgive for real, or have they already turned this page?
I don't think Rose will ever turn that page. And I don't think, given what happens to her, that she has a chance or a desire to forgive. I think she's one of those people who's just very set in their opinions. I think Ginny is the one who goes through the chaos that's in the book and learns to come to terms with it.
¿Con cuál de las hermanas se identifica usted más?
With which of the sisters do you identify, or which of the sisters do you feel closer to you?
Ginny, for sure. Yeah.
¿Por qué?
And why? Why is that?
Because she wants to think things through. When I grew up, I was a good girl. And Ginny's a good girl. I didn't get into trouble. I was on time for school. I didn't do any naughty things in school. I was always honest. I didn't lie to my parents or my grandparents. And sometimes I thought, it's so boring to be a good girl. But if you're a good girl, you have to be aware of what's around you, what the temptations are, what the problems could be if you went ahead and weren't a good girl. And so I think that if you're a good girl, you become very thoughtful and observant. And at least that's what I hope happened to me.
Ya sabemos por qué hay tantos líos en sus...
We know why there are so many troubles in your novels, because you had such a boring teenage years that you want to experience all these troubles through your novels. And I think that if there's any conclusion that we really can get out of your novel and our conversation with you, is that I have the feeling that one of the things that A Thousand Acres shows us is that we're not that good nor that bad. We are all a bit of this bright and dark sides to for instance, you talked about Ginny with care, but Ginny also has a dark side to her, wouldn't you say?
Say that's for the reader to decide. Because when you enjoy a novel or get deep into a novel, then the characters become sort of like friends that you have your own individual opinions about, that may not be the same as, say, your friends' opinions about those characters. And there's plenty of novels that readers disagree about. One of my favorite examples of this is that when I was writing 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, which was a kind of history and analysis of the novel, one book that I was a little bit afraid to read and I thought was really daring to put in was Justine by the Marquis de Sade. But I made myself read it, and pretty soon after I got into it, I realized that the Marquis de Sade is not, as a writer, a sadist, because he's interested in what Justine thinks, in how she experiences the horrors. And I think in our time, he wouldn't be called a bad guy. He would be called a revealer of bad things that are going on around him and how they affect the people that they're happening to. And so, does anybody share my opinion? I have no idea, but that's my opinion. And there's plenty of novels that we all read where we think, that's awful, and where other people think, oh, that's divine.
Usted hace un poco el ejercicio.
You do the contrary exercise to cancellation. From 2023, we're reading books from the past, we want to correct them, and you just consider that Marquis de Sade wasn't that much. How would you say with regard to these cancellation culture people, what would you say to them?
Anything to them. I would just walk right past them and go.
Muy gráfico.
Very graphic.
Usted procede de una familia, bueno,
You come from a liberal family, non-religious. You could talk about miscarriage without being a taboo, but in the novel, feminism is very present. And Ginny, for instance, has a problem with her own body. She doesn't know her own body. Were you aware that many women in the 90s were facing this problem, or is this also a fiction?
I was aware that women had various miscarriages. Some of my cousins, or not my cousins actually, but some of my second cousins were adopted, and we knew why their mother couldn't have children. It wasn't any kind of a stigma in our family. It was just, oh, that's sad. And my mother, when my mother got married, when I was about 11, my older brother and older sister were adopted. So that was just, it was no big deal. It's just a thing.
Hay una cosa que...
There's something that I find very interesting, the sense that you give to water, the meaning that you give to water. You have 6 books, Before the Storm, After the Storm. Water is the possibility of flooding the land, the farm, and affecting the lives of the characters of 1,000 Acres. Is it a way of explaining that we're all at risk, that we can all be flooded by this water at some point?
You give everything all the meaning that it has for you. But the reason I put that in is because in that particular region of Iowa, huge rains in the spring are going to overwhelm the drainage wells and turn the land back into a swamp. So there are some parts of the agricultural world that you don't want to be too dry, but there are other parts, and this is one, that you don't want to be too wet because it's low ground, it's wet, it's already full of water, and you don't want there to be a flood.
Después de tantos...
After so many years living in Iowa, apart from a gossipy writer, do you feel a little bit as a farmer too? Do you have deep knowledge in agriculture and farming?
No. I mean, I did live, when I first moved to Iowa, I lived in a farmhouse, and the farmer across the road had bought the farm that I was living on, and they were going to tear the house down, but they wanted to rent it for a while. And so I did walk around and I did pay attention, and I got some sense of what farming was like. And it always interested me. But when I grew up, I didn't want to have a farm. I wanted to have a horse breeding farm, which is the world's second stupidest idea in terms of spending all of your money. But I loved horses, and I just thought it would be so wonderful to have the horses on my own property.
Estos días le he leído en una entrevista.
In an interview, I read that you said that each novel can be turned into historical fiction by other novelists or other writers. From the point of view of 2023, 1,000 Acres, is it a good historical novel? Is it a good X-ray of the US in the 90s?
I hope so. But it's more like in the 80s, because I finished it around 1990. And then it took a while, it always takes a while for a a manuscript to become a book. But I think it's a good representation, or at least the best I could do, of what life on a farm in the 1980s was. I mean, I like writing historical novels, and I've written The Greenlanders, The All-True Travels and Adventures of Liddy Newton, my most recent novel, which is A Dangerous Business, which takes place in 1880s in Monterey, California. And I really love reading historical novels too. But every novel that is about its own time becomes outdated. You know, there's new generations that come along, and we go and we read Dickens or Trollope or, for that matter, Don Quixote, and we say, well, this must have been what it was like to be alive in those particular times, and that's really interesting and a really good reason to read novels, because the novelist, no matter who he is and when he's living, really wants you, the reader, to feel what it's like to be where he is. And, you know, the thing I love about Don Quixote is that Sancho Panza is the smart guy.
¿Se atrevería a...
Would you dare to rewrite the Quijote as you did with Shakespeare?
un Sancho Panza en Iowa?
Sancho Panza in Iowa, maybe?
I'll think about it. It's a good idea. But it has to be in California.
Bueno, ¿por qué?
Okay.
Why? Why in California?
Porque en California lo ve más...
Because that's where I live now.
En 3 décadas es...
In
California.
Pues entonces ya está, todo arreglado.
Okay, all set. In 30 years, many critics have been published on the novel, and one element is present. 1,000 Acres ends many myths on the American family. Do you still believe in the family as an institution?
Yeah, I think it should, the people who are forming the family and part of the family should choose what kind of institution it is, though. I don't believe that there should be an authoritative dictation to the people who have the families from someone above about what the family should be like and who's the boss and what everybody should do. I think families should be cooperative, and they should be about agreement, love, knowledge, getting along. That's the kind of family I have, and that's the kind of family I like.
Pero no me negará que usted...
But if you allow me this joke, maybe you can create an agency to help divorcees, how to help people go through a divorce and reinvent a new family.
Solo le estoy dando ideas.
I'm just giving you ideas. Quixote in California, counseling.
I'm going to tell you a story. So when my third husband left me and I was living in California, I didn't expect him to do that. And I was quite shocked. Our son was only about, he must have been about 4. And I was really upset. And so I began to get some counseling. And then this guy shows up at my house. He's a wonderful fixer-upper. You know, he knows how to build stuff. He knows how to repair stuff. Plus, he's really gorgeous. And he's older than I am, and he's not married. And the more I saw him and the more I got to know him, the more I didn't quite know how to woo him. because he had decided he was too old for relationships. He was 55 at the time. So I went to my therapist and I said, how do I do this? What am I going to do? I can't seem to win him over. I mean, he was friendly. He was kind and friendly. So my therapist hands me a card, and it's for a beauty shop. And he said, go blonde. And it worked like a charm.
Pues un consejo que...
Well, this is another piece of advice for everyone. Get blonde.
Figure out what the person you want, what his temptation, what most tempts him.
Bueno.
And for my husband,
Por si le gustan las pelirrojas.
Just in case they like redheads.
right. For my husband, the blonde was pretty good. That was the opening. But what really tempted him was my cooking. So I would invite him for dinner a lot, and I would cook him a lot of things, and that was what won him over.
Decíamos antes.
We were saying before that 1,000 Acres was turned into a film in the 90s. I think there's an opera too that has been made, right?
It was made by the Des Moines Opera, and I think it first came out about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. And I went and saw it.
¿Y le gustó?
Did you like it?
I liked the actors, I liked the music. I didn't understand a word of the dialogue. But I told them that I loved it.
Bueno, no voy a decir nada.
Okay, I'm not going to say anything else. The next book that you're going to publish is autobiography on yourself, alternative. What does this mean exactly?
Yes. When I had my 50th high school graduation, I went back to St. Louis for that, and I drove around, and I was amazed at how interesting St. Louis still was. And someone who interviewed me for a St. Louis paper said, have you ever or are you ever going to set a book in St. Louis? And I realized that I hadn't. And so maybe a year and a half ago, I thought, oh, I know. I'll write an alternative autobiography of myself, but this person who's my age and, shorter, she's a musician rather than a writer, and she stays in St. Louis. And one of the best parts of it was that I could put in the weirdest St. Louis street names. And so there's a beautiful house on a street, and I don't know if you're going to believe this or not, but there's a beautiful house on a street near Forest Park named Skinker. 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 Now, why would you name a street Skinker? I have no idea, but I put her in that house.
Estamos aquí ya en confianza.
Well, this is a safe space. Jane will answer any questions. You can also ask her anything related to love. So please feel free. Q&A.
Ahí hay una. Es que es tan tímido.
They're a bit shy, I think.
I love questions, so please ask. I love answering questions.
Hello, Jane. Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I am curious to know, how did you prepare yourself in order to revisit King Lear? Did you read a lot of secondary literature, or you just went with your own interpretation of the play?
I read King Lear 5 times in a row. I mean, I'd already read it in school, but I read it 5 times in a row to get the plot into my head. And then I looked up whatever information there was on the materials that Shakespeare had built Lear around. And then that was all I did. The rest of the research was about farming, about the particular territory that they lived in, and that sort of thing.
¿Tenemos más preguntas por ahí?
Do we have more questions? Over there, yes?
Hi. Thank you for coming. I'm very happy you can here. I would like to know, in your experience living in different parts of the world, how important is the territory in the novel? I mean, for example, do you think if this novel were written in California instead of Iowa, do you think the character will be very different? Because in my opinion, I was living in San Diego for 4 years, 20 years ago. And for me, it was really different when I travel a little around the States. And for me, there were different countries, the Middle East, the West East, and I mean, when I was reading the novel, I sometimes I imagine how could this be if, for example, in Los Angeles or San Francisco. Do you think it's very important, the place?
Yes, I think setting is exceptionally important because setting dictates what the characters are going to be able to do physically in the course of the novel. And I don't just mean, where they're going to be running around and whether they're going to have a horse or not. Those are a couple of things. But also what they sense in terms of weather, in terms of smell, in terms of what they see. And I think that's really important as a novel. I would say, in 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, I analyzed what I called the pyramid of the novel. And it was like this. And then the bottom floor was language, and that's where the door is. And then the next layer was character and plot. And then the next layer above that was theme and setting. And then the next layer above that was complexity. So I put theme and setting in the same layer because the setting dictates the theme. Because the characters have to navigate the setting, and that means that the meaning that the author gives to the plot and the characters is dictated by the setting. So setting and theme go together. And I don't know that I could have written a novel based in a farm in, say, the Catskills or any place else. That setting in northern Iowa was the inspiration.
Más preguntas ahí, mira.
More questions. Hello. Yes, I'm going to ask in Spanish. I really enjoyed your books, but at the same time I have felt very sad after reading them. Your capacity to observe, it is incredible to get to know you a little bit. I don't know if your vision of the world is slightly sad or melancholic, but I think your books are very beautiful and sad at the same time. Some of the scenes have really touched me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the sadness in the books that have been translated and published by Sexto Piso they were all written when I was in my 30s. And when you're in your 30s, you've got the kids, you've got the husband, you've got the job, you've got a dog. Everything seems like a crisis. And you don't know really how well to navigate all of that. But my natural temperament is more comic. And so the next book I wrote after 1,000 Acres was called Moo, and it was a comedy set at a university. And subsequent books some have been serious and some have been not so serious. Excuse me. The one that came out about 2 years ago now, that is Perestroika in Paris. And that's about a horse who escapes from Auteuil racecourse and moves and goes into Paris and lives in and around the Place de Trocadero. And that is completely not sad.
Hay muchos deberes.
There's a lot of homework here for people from Sexto Piso. Many books that need translation so that we get to know Jane a little bit more. Do we have more questions? Good afternoon. Thank you for being here and thank you for this conversation. In the case of the front page, is it a photograph or is it a picture? What can we see? Did you choose it or was it the publishing house that chose it?
Chose it, and I think they also had it drawn.
Nos va a contestar la editorial.
But we can ask the publishing house. It is a painting chosen by my colleague here sitting next to me. I think how much of you is in that image, because I think this image conveys many things.
Or braids. And my hair was always in my face. And my mother couldn't get me to comb my hair very often. So that's not me.
Igual a su madre le habría gustado.
Maybe your mother would have liked to see you with a combed hair, right?
Una pregunta más, por favor.
Any more questions? There's one more over there.
So speaking about pending books to read, you know that we are all reading Jane Smiley, but what's Jane Smiley reading right now?
Well, I'm reading a book for review. I can never remember the guy's first name. He has 3 names, and the last name is Key. And the book's going to come out in June, early June. And it is an incredibly hilarious book called, it's about how to save your marriage or saving your marriage or something like that. And it's a memoir about when his wife turned out to be having an affair and what happened after that. It's very funny. I'm also, so at the moment I'm reading nonfiction, and a lot of the books I read are assignments. But another book I'm reading is another nonfiction book that's being republished, and it's called Badland. And it's about the eastern part of Montana and how the railroads and some other types of advertisers lured the settlers there in the early 20th century through false advertising. So it's an American tradition.
¿Y echa de menos leer por placer?
Do you miss reading for pleasure?
I always read for pleasure. These books are very interesting, so that's a pleasure.
Más preguntas, por favor.
Do we have more questions?
Hi, Jane. Thank you for coming. I would like to know what you think of the film 1,000 Acres. Did you like it? And did you like the characters of Michelle Pfeiffer and Jennifer Jason-Leigh, Jason Robards, and Jessica Lange. Do you like how they are?
Yes, I liked it. I thought they did a good job, and it was really interesting. The problem with any film is that they have to squeeze the novel into, 2 hours or even 2.5 or 3. And that's very difficult. And one of the things I like that has been invented since is series, where you can watch, 10 episodes that go through the novel bit by bit. Excuse me. And I quite like series, and in some ways I prefer series to movies if they're based on a novel.
Deduzco que le gustó más la película que la ópera.
Did you prefer the film compared to the opera? But in the interview that you said it was a shame that Paul Newman said no to that role.
Well, we can all wish, I think Jason Robards did a good job, but I think if Paul Newman had been in it, there would have been this interesting aspect of, here's a man who's gorgeous, successful, and yet he's collapsing right in front of our faces. And his looks are in some sense the reason that the girls are so good looking. And so there's this sense of another aspect to the family that maybe would have been more revealed with Paul Newman in it rather than Jason Robards.
¿Hay más preguntas entre el público? Hay.
More questions? Good afternoon. After reading all your books translated into Spanish, it is great to be able to hear you today. I wanted to ask you on how you write, the process in general, from the idea. How many ideas do you have in a drawer? How much time goes by from the original idea to starting writing? How is your process of writing, if you can explain a little more?
Well, in general, I'm always working on 2 novels at a time. So I will finish a draft or most of a draft of one of them. I'll set it aside, get started on the next one, get stuck, go back to the first one, finish it, go back to the second one, start a third one. That's the way I do. My daily process is, as I always like to say, and you can correct my accent, but I always like to say it's très proustienne, because I sit up in bed with my laptop and I type on my laptop for about 2 hours, and I try to put in, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 words. I do a lot of research. I love to do research, and it's way easier to do research now that we have the internet than it used to be, when I had to actually go places and look at things. And I don't mean just settings. I mean interview people and stuff like that. So yeah, that's more or less my process.
¿Hay alguna pregunta más?
Any more questions? Microphone, please. When you have talked of how you write your novels, and this one in particular, I understood that it was clear to you which novel you wanted to write when you started, and the story based on King Lear's story. But I imagine that by writing, maybe you discovered things on the characters or on human condition that you didn't know or that you didn't imagine. Does this occur? Does this happen?
Absolutely. Every idea is just an idea. And what you want in an idea is something that stimulates your curiosity. And so you get the idea, you start looking into it, you start doing research about the setting, about the possibilities in the plot, about the psychology of the characters. Every novel has to be plausible. And so you have to do the research that makes even the weirdest things plausible. And then as you do that, it develops. And that's why you have to do several drafts. Because when you start the first draft, you have no idea what you're doing. When you finish the first draft and read it through again, you realize that there are things you didn't know and still don't know. You need to learn more in order to do the second draft. Then let's say you send it to your editor and your editor says, you need to fix this, you need to fix that, you need to cut this, you need to cut that. And so you have to come to an agreement with your editor and you have to try and fix all that stuff. And sometimes, as with, for me, the Greenlanders, you don't really need more than the first draft for some reason. And I don't even know why that was. But for other novels, for example, for me, Private Life, which came out in 2010, I could not come up with a draft that satisfied my editor. And I found that very frustrating. But then as I worked through it, I came to realize and understand what it was that was missing. And so I was able to fix that one too. It's just the way it is. You have to be patient with yourself and with the editor. But not with the critics. You don't have to be patient with them.
¿Qué relación tiene usted con los críticos?
Which relationship do you have with critics?
I ignore them.
Estamos llegando al final.
Okay, so we're reaching the end.
Let me add to that. I do book reviews, and I like book reviews that are done by other novelists because I think that's a way of communicating and talking about work. I do not like reviews that are done by professional critics whose only job is to criticize. And I think the more novels they read, the more perfectionist they become. So I don't pay any attention to them.
Decía que sí.
I was saying maybe a last question before the end. Now is the time. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question to Jane Smiley. Why is your name in the song by Wilco? Why is your name there? I never knew why. Can you maybe reveal the mystery?
I can reveal the mystery. So when what's his name? The guy who runs Amazon, whose name shall not be spoken. He used to have a gathering that he would invite all kinds of writers and artists to in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was lots of fun, and I met some really interesting people. I met Bette Midler. We were just walking down the street together. And anyway, my husband went with me to one of those, and I was back in the hotel room probably writing something and drinking a Diet Coke, and he went to get breakfast. And he sat down at the breakfast table with, I can't remember his name, but the Wilco guy. And the Wilco guy was...
Jeff Tweedy.
Say what?
Jeff Tweedy.
Jeff Tweedy, right. And the Wilco guy was evidently depressed. And so my husband asked him what was wrong, and he was honest. And my husband gave him some advice. And they probably just chatted for about an hour, and the advice was good. And we had no idea that it was going to turn into this song that lasts forever. But it was a very sweet song, and I really am glad they made it.
Bueno,
Sorry.
pues ahora está un poco acatarrada Jane, esperemos que se recupere.
Jane has got a slight cold. She'll be signing books now.
Allergies.
Mucho peor.
It's not contagious.
Va a firmaros los
She will be signing the books here. She will also be tomorrow afternoon in 2 different bookstores. So if you want to have a chat with her and see her again, thank you very much. Thank you to Fundación Telefónica. Thank you to Fundación Telefónica for this conversation within the cycle of the future that we want. Thank you very much, Jane Smiley. Big hand for her.
I appreciate it. Thank you.